Sweetness and Light by Matthew Arnold. Hello and welcome once again. Sweetness and Light. This is the title of the first chapter in the collection of essays, Culture and Anarchy, written by Matthew Arnold. In this session, I shall try to explain and give a summary of the entire chapter in very simple terms. Before I begin, I would like to suggest that you run your eyes over the points in the slide as I do the explanation. Victorian Era is a long period of time from 1837, when Queen Victoria came to the throne, until the end of her reign in 1901. Breakthroughs in scientific and economic fields brought about great changes in the social outlook and setup that in turn influenced literature and literary criticism. Biological and evolutionary theories, which were the essence of the growth of rationalism, shattered the age-old religious concepts and theories. The breakdown of faith in the religious sphere was followed by an attempt to prevent the age from degenerating into chaos. Matthew Arnold, the most liberal and modern of the Victorian giants, wrote essays on literary, educational, and social subjects that established him as the leading critic of the day. He is one of the few writers who are equally adept in prose as well as poetry. Arnold sharply criticized the provincialism, Philistinism, sectarianism, and utilitarian materialism of English life and culture. He argued that England needed more intellectual curiosity, more ideas, and a more comparative European outlook. Culture and Anarchy, a collection of essays by Matthew Arnold, published in the year 1869, contains many of Arnold's central critical arguments. The first chapter, Sweetness and Light, is devoted to his concept of culture as sweetness and light. Arnold presents culture as the classical ideal of human perfection rather than a smattering of Greek and Latin. Sweetness and Light. The phrase sweetness and light was first used by Jonathan Swift in his mock heroic prose satire, The Battle of the Books, which was published in 1704. The Battle of the Books was a defense of classical learning, which was published as an introduction to Swift's work, A Tale of a Tub. The Battle of the Books, it's a short satire, and it depicts a literal battle between books in the King's Library that was housed in St. James's Palace at the time of writing this work. Because of the satire, the Battle of the Books has become a term for the struggle for supremacy between the ancients and the moderns. The moderns took the position that the modern age of science and reason was superior to the superstitious and limited world of Greece and Rome. The phrase sweetness and light gained popularity during the Victorian era, when Matthew Arnold chose this as the title of the first section of his book, Culture and Anarchy, an essay in political and social criticism, published in 1869. The phrase sweetness and light represents beauty and intelligence, the two key components of an excellent culture. Matthew Arnold begins the essay Sweetness and Light by talking about what people generally think about the concept of culture. people who disapprove of the concept of culture speak about its motive as being mere curiosity, exclusiveness, or vanity. Culture that is internalized through an elementary knowledge of the classical languages is valued mainly out of vanity and ignorance. Such an idea will only serve to separate people who possess this knowledge from those who do not. This, according to Matthew Arnold, does not constitute real culture. The term culture is used by the English people in a derogatory manner to mean something frivolous. They do not recognize the importance of curiosity. They ignore its real sense. Therefore, in this essay, Matthew Arnold proceeds to analyze the different types of curiosity on the basis of the estimate offered by the French critic Sainte-Beuve in the Quarterly Review. He talks about curiosity about intellectual matters. In fact, curiosity about intellectual matters is regarded as a futile endeavor. What is more important is that curiosity about the things of the mind, according to him, simply for their own sakes and also for the pleasure of seeing them as they are. So this signifies a balanced mind, which is the opposite of a mind affected by the diseased impulse to condemn curiosity as blameworthy. The main purpose of engaging in studies is either to increase the excellence of our nature or to become more intelligent. And this is generally classified as scientific passion. But then there is another view of culture that sees it not as scientific passion, but as something driven by the nobler intention of doing good to other people. And that is described by Matthew Arnold, that is this desire to do good. Matthew Arnold describes this as the impulse towards action, help, and beneficence, the desire for stopping human error, clearing human confusion, and diminishing the sum of human misery, the noble aspiration to leave the world better and happier than we found it. Thus, according to Matthew Arnold, the main aspect of the concept of culture is social. Therefore, the origin of culture is not actually curiosity, but a desire for perfection. The moral and social desire to do good is the driving force behind the concept of culture. And he says that this idea was best expressed by Bishop Thomas Wilson, who was the Anglican Bishop of Sodor and Man Diocese. He includes a quotation in the essay. He says that the idea was best expressed by the bishop in the words, quotation, "to make reason and the will of God prevail." In other words, the desire to do good should combine with the worthy notions of reason and the will of God. No action can be salutary and beneficial unless it is based on reason and the will of God. Till recently, we were inhabiting a closed intellectual world that seldom allowed the light of faith and ardor to pass through and shine upon us. The rigorous adherence to the old social, political, and religious routine has now given way to a new routine on a wider intellectual plane. But then there is the risk of misinterpreting some new invention, some novelty as the will of God, and also following action for its own sake, without caring about whether the will of God would prevail in their actions. Therefore, it is very important to remember that culture is something, firstly, that believes in perfection. Secondly, it is the study and pursuit of perfection. And thirdly, it does not exclude anything from getting accepted as part of it. Which means that, culture is something that keeps adding on more and more things into it. So when one endeavors to see things and learn them for personal satisfaction, it is indeed the beginning of the effort to make God's will prevail. It is a kind of preparation that one makes towards nobler aspirations. But at times, even that is mistaken for curiosity and denigrated as selfish, petty, and unprofitable. According to Matthew Arnold, religion is the voice of the deepest human experience. It not only gives sanction to the noble aims of culture, which is to achieve perfection and make it prevail, but also determines what constitutes human perfection. Religion pronounces the presence of God within you. Similarly, culture also insists that perfection is an internal condition. The ideal of human perfection can be achieved through an expansion of thought and feeling that contribute to the dignity, wealth, and happiness of human nature. Culture also includes making new additions to it to expand its powers, wisdom, and beauty. Therein lies the true value of culture. Culture is not something to be achieved and then just left behind. It has to continue. It has to keep growing. And every individual is part of one great structure. Therefore, individual perfection is meaningless. Every individual must involve his fellow beings in his march towards perfection. Anyone who shirks this responsibility would find himself weakened in his own personal development. Therefore, it is similar to a religious obligation. The word perfection, as per Matthew Arnold's definition, is an expansion of all the powers which make the beauty and worth of human nature. It is not the overall development of just one aspect to the exclusion of the rest. So if culture is perfection, it is not having something but becoming something. Now this is because culture is an inward condition of the mind and the spirit. In the essay, Matthew Arnold speaks about the modern civilization of England as being more mechanical and external than the civilization of Greece and Rome. Culture, being the same as the ideal of perfection, is in fact of greater importance in a country like England. This is because in England the characters of perfection are met with defiance, and he gives the reasons for this. Reason number one, the mechanical and material civilization of England is not in agreement with the idea of perfection, which is actually an inward condition of the mind and the spirit. Reason number two, the strong individualism of the British people is at variance with the idea of perfection. And reason number three, a hatred of all limits, unrestricted swing of individual personality, every man for himself attitude, they are all against the idea of perfection. So because of all these reasons, Matthew Arnold believed that culture had a significant role to perform in England. But it is not an easy task even for the true preachers of culture to achieve this. Even they will be viewed with suspicion more than as friends or benefactors. He mentions the prophet Jeremiah, who has himself experienced spiritual darkness in his life. So even when people viewed him with suspicion, then how else would they treat the preachers of culture? So they will have to, the preachers of culture, they will have to work harder to convince people about the nobility of their intentions. The greater danger lies in their unwarranted faith in machinery. That is, the English people, they attached a lot of importance to concepts like freedom, population, railroads, wealth, religious organizations. In fact, all of these were classified as machinery. They were treated as precious goals by the British people. They thought that perfection can be achieved when people reveal their aspirations. But the aspirations of culture, which should actually be the study of perfection, are not fulfilled unless what they desire has something good in it. Culture is not just the acceptance of the freedom of people to desire and do what they want. It is drawing them towards the ideal of perfection, beauty, and greatness. It is getting the raw, simple man to understand the value of culture. England has always equated her material resources with greatness. It is in fact innate to regard something like coal as the basis of national greatness, because greatness is actually a spiritual condition. It is something that would pave the way for love, interest, and admiration. Arnold next proceeds to make a comparison between Elizabethan England and Victorian England. He thinks that Elizabethan age possessed greatness in terms of spiritual and not material effort. It is real culture that will erase the misconceptions about material advancement as indicators of culture and also set standards of perfection. The pursuit of wealth and material things has gained greater importance in the current times. The main purpose of culture is that culture teaches us that wealth is just as worthless as machinery. In the absence of knowledge, the whole world, according to Matthew Arnold, would go to the Philistines. So, who are the Philistines? Philistines are people who believe that everything is about achieving wealth and becoming rich. It is only culture that can save the future generations from descending to the vulgarity of Philistines. To the people of England, population, bodily health, and vigor hold an exalted position, though they are all just part of machinery. Big families mean a lot to them, and so do physical health and vigor. In fact, health and vigor are actually more connected to a spiritual condition than wealth or population. But the pursuit of health and vigor, according to Matthew Arnold, should be directed towards higher spiritual goals. Instead of relying on physical exercises for fitness or drinking and eating for bodily pleasures, one should actually be directing all these activities towards the formation of the spirit and character. In this context, Matthew Arnold mentions two Greek words, aphia and euphia. Aphia stands for a not finely tempered nature, and euphia represents a finely tempered nature. That is, these are two words. He uses these two words in order to explain the notion of perfection exactly as culture conceives it. That is, he says that aphia represents a nature. Not finely tempered means you give yourself up to things that relate to the body, whereas euphia is a finely tempered nature, and according to him, it is euphia that gives the exact notion of perfection as culture conceives it. It is a harmonious perfection, a perfection in which the characters of beauty and intelligence are both present, which unites the two noblest of things. It is euphia that represents the notion of perfection. As Jonathan Swift says, sweetness and light mean beauty and intelligence, which also symbolize the ideal of perfection as stipulated by culture. Aphia stands for the Philistines, and euphia represents the man who tends towards sweetness and light or culture. Arnold also mentions the reason for the immense spiritual significance of the Greeks. It is mainly because the Greeks have been inspired by the ideal of human perfection. In fact, sweetness and light are nothing but the characters of perfection. Poetry is believed to be a manifestation of human nature. But religion is of greater significance. Why? Because it is a more important manifestation of human nature, because of its broader scale for perfection, and also because of its sway over a larger number of people. The dominant idea of poetry is of a human nature perfect on the moral side. Poetry may not be as successful as religion in conquering our animality. The best in Greek art and poetry are the ones in which religion and poetry coalesce. This is where the idea of beauty and of perfect human nature add to itself a religious vigor and devout energy. It is also important to strengthen the moral fiber of the society. This, according to Arnold, it is a combination. It is a combination of the idea of beauty, harmony, and human perfection with a strong moral fiber that can save us from Philistinism. Absolute inward peace and satisfaction is actually different from what people normally believe to be inner peace. Absolute peace is achieved not when we are close to ordinary moral perfection, but when we reach that state of complete spiritual perfection. Arnold next proceeds to a discussion on religion and religious organizations. Religious organizations can only lead us to a state of incomplete perfection. This is evidenced in Puritanism, which is probably the best manifestation of the Englishman's race towards moral development and self-conquest. People think of religion as something very precious and worth propagating because it has helped us to conquer the plain faults of our animality. They tend to ignore the shortcomings of religious organizations also. The test by the ideal of absolute perfection should actually apply to the religious organizations also. The truth is that even the men of culture and poetry, fail in the early steps towards perfection, particularly in subduing the obvious faults of our animality. The Puritans, on the other hand, have been richly rewarded even though their ideal of perfection is inadequate and narrow. In this context, Arnold says that it is really unfortunate that the men of culture and poetry have been judged wrongly even though their ideal of beauty, sweetness, light, and compassionate human nature continued to remain the true ideal of perfection. Arnold also makes an interesting comparison between the Pilgrim Fathers and the writers Shakespeare and Virgil. Arnold speaks about the good and the happiness Puritans have accomplished, but one should not oversee the inadequacies of their ideal of human perfection. Protestantism, for example, will never take man to the true goal, which is the state of perfection. Arnold also criticizes the non-conformist religious organizations for their inability to help man attain a true and satisfying ideal of perfection. Arnold is equally critical of all religious organizations that teach us to call ourselves the children of God. We have to prove ourselves worthy of such an honor in our words and also action. Arnold then mentions a newspaper report about the nonconformist church. The newspaper Daily Telegraph, with the largest circulation, carried this particular report on the vices and external hideousness of the city of London. The article stressed on the gross economic disparities. The article was mainly on the economic disparities. And when religion or where religion fails, culture, with its single-minded love for perfection, can make reason and the will of God prevail. One of the greatest rewards of culture is the flexibility accorded by sweetness and light. All politicians, even Gladstone including, have emphasized the importance of laying a strong foundation for material well-being. They all tend to ignore the spiritual aspect. Culture also accepts that the future may benefit from it, but in the process, it is to be ascertained that Philistinism would also disappear. One has to make sure that Philistinism would disappear. And talking about the benefits of religious organizations, Arnold says that while Puritanism served to strengthen the moral fiber of the land, nonconformist church broke the ecclesiastical dominance over minds and prepared people for the freedom of thought. It is only by pursuing such ideals that Philistinism can be destroyed. The Oxford movement was a movement of high church members of the Church of England, which eventually developed into Anglo-Catholicism. The movement's philosophy was known as Tractarianism after its series of publications, The Tracts for the Times, published between 1833 and 1841. Matthew Arnold described the Oxford movement as something that has revealed the truth that beauty and sweetness are the essential characters of human perfection. His allegiance towards the Oxford movement is explicit in the line where he says that the sentiment for beauty and sweetness, which he got from Oxford, has been responsible for making him support many failed causes and also oppose triumphant ones. The leader of the Oxford movement was John Henry Newman, who was a cardinal, a clergyman, and also a professor at Oxford. The Tractarian philosophy was developed by the practitioners of the Oxford movement in order to restore the traditions and customs of the Roman Church as against the views of the liberals. Middle class liberalism had as its cardinal points the following: the Reform Bill, local self-government in politics, free trade, unrestricted competition, industrial fortune making, religion, dissent, and Protestant. Matthew Arnold calls liberalism the great force of Philistinism. However, it is not to be seen anymore. Oxford movement is the new force that has opposed liberalism and generated a keen desire for beauty and intelligence. The motive of the Oxford movement is the same as that of culture, but it needs to work more. Arnold next proceeds to discuss liberalism and democracy. Democracy, with its promises of administrative reform, law reform, and educational reform, is at any rate preferable to liberalism. The bane of liberalism is its faith in the material or the machinery, as Arnold puts it. According to him, unnecessary importance is given to voting rights. Democracy actually encourages Philistinism by attaching great importance to material achievements. It fails to appreciate the value of progress in sweetness and light. Arnold stresses on the need for an increased spiritual activity, sweetness, light, life, and sympathy. Jacobinism, which signified a severance from the past and the introduction of new doctrines for the future, is opposed to culture. Now, this is because of its fierceness and addiction to an abstract system. According to Arnold, the people chosen to guide the human race are essentially unsuitable. In this context, he also mentions the introduction of the worship of Apollo in Rome, and then he speaks about a current in the minds of the Romans that led to the worship of Apollo. But then he denies the role of Tarquin, the seventh and the last king of Rome, in this. The main advantage of culture, according to Arnold, is that culture helps us to see the flaws of humans. Culture discourages one from putting faith overly on any single individual. But Arnold, he was very much influenced by Benjamin Franklin, whom he calls the very embodiment of sanity and clear sense. And he also mentions Bentham. In fact, Bentham was an English philosopher and a social reformer. He is regarded as a founder of modern utilitarianism, which is based on the philosophy that it is the greatest happiness of the greatest number that is a measure of right and wrong. So this philosophy seems to disregard individual welfare. So that is one of the flaws of the utilitarian philosophy. And Matthew Arnold mentions Bentham's ideology, pointing to his fanaticism. In fact, men of accomplishments like Auguste Comte and James Stuart Mill have a lot in them that people admire, but they do not symbolize ultimate perfection like the rabbi according to Jacobinism. Matthew Arnold also criticizes Frederick Harrison, who blames both culture and the men of culture. Frederick Harrison is an English author. He had published the positivism of the French sociologist Auguste Comte in Great Britain. Auguste Comte was a philosopher. He was a mathematician, a social scientist, and he was best known as the originator of positivism, which is an approach to the philosophy and history of science. So Arnold criticizes all these people, Frederick Harrison, it reiterates that the perfection of human nature is sweetness and light. So it is as powerful, that is, culture is as powerful as religion in warding off confusion and evil. The pursuit of perfection is actually the pursuit of sweetness and light. And sweetness and light are two mutually dependent characters. Culture stands for the passion for sweetness and light, and also the desire to make them prevail and remain all pervasive for as many as possible. So that alone can lead to all-round happiness, progress in art and literature, and spiritual development. Arnold criticizes the people who supply ready-made intellectual food to the masses in the belief that they know what the people want. Religious and political organizations attempt this kind of indoctrination, much like popular literature. But culture, on the other hand, only strives to bring about equality and create an atmosphere of sweetness and light. Men of culture are also the apostles of equality, who spread their best ideas and knowledge by filtering out all that is bad. Matthew Arnold makes special mention of the names of the men of culture. Abelard during the Middle Ages, Lessing and Herder in Germany. In fact, Herder was a German philosopher, theologian, poet and critic. And Lessing was also a German writer, philosopher, dramatist, critic, and also an outstanding representative of the Enlightenment era. His plays and theoretical writings have substantially influenced the development of German literature. So all these, the men of culture, they have humanized knowledge, they have broadened the basis of life and intelligence, they have diffused sweetness and light, they have made reason and the will of God prevail, and they have joined hands with God in all endeavors. So finally, to conclude, we may say that the essay Sweetness and Light disregards the reality of material being and emphasizes the significance of the pursuit of perfection. Thank you.